Stephan Faris is a journalist that writes for Time and Business Week. He has the time to delve deeper than most in the journalistic world and investigate substantial issues, not least of which recently was the issue of the plight and the continued plight of the so-called Gladiator Tomb, one of many high-profile, high-risk sites, recently discovered that captured the attention of the world that remains at risk. Stephan.
Hi, thanks. So I'm here at this conference on new media and social media as a representative of the old media, and in compensation I've asked to be allowed more than 140 characters at a time. As a reporter, I'm a generalist, and so I'm going to talk very broadly about social media and old media rather than specifically about conservation. And I've also been trained in a medium where brevity is key, and so I'm going to try to keep my remarks short so I can hear what the other speakers are doing. What I find exciting about the media in general these days is the distinction between old media and new media, between established brands like Time Magazine that I write for, Business Week that I write for, and social networks where each person in a sense is their own brand, their own person. That distinction is increasingly blurring. And so personally as a reader, I very rarely will go to an established news site. I get most of my news through Twitter or Facebook or to some extent through conversations in the hallways of where I work. And that's exciting. This morning I've been following the vote in Parliament for the Italian president on Twitter, and you can see 1,000 different people commenting, and you get the information in real time. Last month when I went to Cyprus to cover the banking crisis there, again I used Twitter to do it. I parachuted into Cyprus, basically, landed in a country I had never been to before, didn't know very much about, and in a very short amount of time, my goal was to turn around a story about how the impact was being felt locally. And so what did I do? I turned to Twitter. I looked to see who was talking about Cyprus, who was talking about not necessarily the banks, but about the experiences people were having. And I wrote to them on Twitter and established contact, and they, in a sense, gave me the end to that world very quickly that I knew nothing about and that I was then able to explore and then spell out for the readers. So that to me is kind of what the type of journalism that I do is. It's, especially when you're a generalist, you dive into a world that you know nothing about and you write about it for readers that know very little about it as well. And so what I always do when I need to do this is I try to think about finding somebody who can guide me, trying to find myself. I like to think of it as a Virgil who can guide me through whatever subject it is. And almost always there are Virgils in every area you look for, whether it's Italian politics or an environmental battle somewhere, or conservation and heritage, or I once did a story on the Italian postal system, and I found out there are people who devoted their whole lives to understanding postal systems. And so there's always a Virgil in every sphere. Now, what is interesting to me about social media is that it's kind of blown the doors open to all these worlds. Now, instead of having to search for a Virgil, call up a friend and say, I'm going to Key West, can you tell me who you know in Key West, and find your way that way? All of a sudden you can kind of step in, open the doors with search keys and everything else, and all of a sudden you have all these people, these Virgils, having conversations with each other, and you can listen in on them, and you can start talking to them. And instead of hunting for Virgils, once your presence becomes known, they're coming to you and saying, have you heard this? Do you know about this? People who follow it can send you information or tips or whatever it is. And so in that sense, the old media and new media aren't just blurring in terms of how we consume news, how we look at news, where we go to get our news. It's blurring how we make the news, how we produce the news. It's no longer, a story is no longer necessarily that a journalist goes to a place, interviews a subject, and reports about it to a reader. Now the journalists sometimes turn into readers. The subjects become journalists telling their own stories. The readers become subjects of their own stories in the same world that they're in. In short, we all become part of a big conversation, an ongoing conversation in which the articles that I produce are just one part, rather than 20 years ago, almost the only conversation, or at least the only bridge between the reader and the subject. Now, this is true in just about every subject I write about, but I think it's most important in areas like the subject of this conference, which is conservation. These are areas where the readers and the public have a strong emotional stake in what they see. They don't want to see these monuments crumble. But the gap between the reader at home and the subject, the archaeological site or the entity responsible for curating that site, has traditionally been very wide. Now all of a sudden, to use the analogy I used before, that chasm, which was once so far away with the reader, the journalist essentially bringing a piece of news across the chasm and giving it to the reader, who is only able to kind of look sadly across the chasm and go, what a pity. All of a sudden, everybody's in the same room, and they're talking, they're having a conversation, they're acting. There's a lot more space for people to get involved, to bring resources, ideas where they're needed, to push for actions, to make things happen, and not just in the pages of a newspaper, but in the real world. That's excitement about this blurring is what interests me, and is why I'm excited about hearing the other speakers today, and why I'm going to now sit and listen. Thanks.
Thank you.